Okay, good morning, y'all. It's 10 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm excited to get to talk to y'all today about repugnant markets. And this week, I hope you all are enjoying yourselves at Mises U. I've met a lot of students who say it's their first time here. I'm so excited for y'all to get to experience this, and I hope you're really enjoying it. This week, I know you've heard a lot about free markets and how clearly the superior way, if you care about human flourishing, we started off with that with Tom Woods on Sunday night, why we should care about economics so we can learn and understand these kinds of things. Of course, that is true. Unfortunately, not everybody believes or agrees with that. So, including even the Nobel Prize Committee. So in 2012, Alvin Roth won the Nobel Prize for his market design, his work in market design. Roth said that his aim in market design is to know the workings and requirements of particular markets well enough to fix them when they're broken, or to build markets from scratch when they're missing. So we just heard from Timothy Terrell, a lot of problems when the markets are broken or when they're missing is actually the fault not of the market, but of government intervention. So we're going to flesh out some of this. But basically what Roth is saying is when there's market failure, somebody clever like Roth or one of his buddies needs to come along. They need to come to the rescue with some kind of fancy and complicated solution. And we'll discuss one of Roth's solution in some detail later. One of the cases where he says market design is needed, one of those cases is when the good being exchanged is considered morally repugnant. People are offended by this particular good that's being exchanged. Ross says that some transactions are repugnant in some times and places. He says that can change. These exchanges can become more repugnant or less repugnant in time. So some of the examples that he cites are horse meat or dog meat for food, slavery, lending at interest, narcotics, pollution permits, and dwarf-tossing. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about dwarf-tossing for fun. But anyway, dwarf-tossing is a sport where men compete to see who can throw a little person the farthest. I know this is probably shocking to you innocent young people, but I apologize to your mother for you seeing this, but here we go. Here is dwarf tossing. Hold on, it gets better.
When I go, I put on that helmet, I put on the harness. I am the superhero for the night. I'm Mighty Mike Murga, and I'm the mini man behind the dwarf tossing extravaganza.
Okay. Now, you may find this surprising, shocking, but the little people of America, they condemn the sport and they say it's dehumanizing. They claim that it is, quote, the objectification of individuals with dwarfism. The little people of America, they actively campaign against dwarf tossing and they call for its prohibition. But who's it harming? I mean, for the little people, yes, there's a certain amount of indignity for sure, but there are also risks of injury for little people, not in the tossing, but in the landing. But it seems like Mighty Mike Murga, the guy in the video, Mighty Mike Murga, he understands Rothbard's claim that the only rights that make sense are property rights. And he even understands the principle of self-ownership. In this video, I'm not including the whole video. Don't look for it on YouTube. But anyway, here's some things Mighty Mike says. He says, it's my body. I can do with it what I want. People love to throw a midget. I'm just friggin' good at it. He says, hey, You want to throw a little person? Pay me a few bucks. Now's your chance. He emphasizes, and this is important, he says, I'm asking you to throw me for a little reimbursement. But he does qualify. He says, but I do it as a sport. So, I mean, he's a proud man. He says, I do it as a sport. So I want to point out, it may seem crass, but it is a serious sport. And there are judges who measure these tosses with precision, and they are legit judges. So check this one out.
Some midgets.
Now, wait a minute. Why does this guy look familiar? Is that, I think Ryan McMakin may be doing a little bit of moonlighting. So anyway, dwarf tossing is something that's been criticized as this is morally repugnant. And this should be banned. So I want to go through some of the arguments why markets like this can be allowed and can function properly like a market. So first, I want to dispense with the stupid argument against repugnant markets like horse meat and dwarf tossing. And then we'll get to the more substantive arguments made by Roth and others. So the first one is that the market produces gross stuff. You'll hear people say something like, well, dwarf tossing is just gross. You know, that's gross. I hate free markets or capitalism because you end up with stuff like dwarf tossing, and that's just horrible. And you have these nasty brutes that are throwing little people for entertainment, and that's a bad influence on others, right? There are spillover effects because other people are entertained by this, and it's just the objectification of midgets. Sorry, little people. So you'll hear that objection, and I have to use Tom Wood's rhetorical question. Well, how can we possibly overcome that, right? This is some devastating objection. Well, first, dwarf tossing and horse meat and all the other things could also be produced under socialism, right? Socialism has plenty of gross stuff. Capitalism's advantage is that the market provides the amount of the gross stuff that is preferred by consumers, and it's determined by this profit and loss system. So we have the right amount of it, not too much, not too little. And secondly, any lowbrow or distasteful good that is produced in a market economy is not a knock on capitalism. Right? It's not the fault of capitalism that we have gross stuff produced. Remember from the other Klein lecture on Monday, Peter said that the successful entrepreneur is best at anticipating and producing what consumers want. And here, at this point, I don't want to necessarily emphasize the actions of the entrepreneur, but the last part of that the entrepreneur is anticipating producing what the consumers want. So whether that is repugnant or whether that is classy, right? So in anti-capitalistic mentality, Mises wrote despairingly of the popularity of what he called detective stories. But he said, it's not the fault of capitalism that the common man does not appreciate uncommon books. Right? It's not the fault of the market that that's what is produced. It's because it's what is valued. In fact, Edmund Opitz said, we can't expect what's produced in a market to be any more moral or highbrow or elite than the actors themselves that are in the markets. He said, the inherent frailties and shortcomings of the market follow from a definition of it. The market consists of people in free, voluntary exchange of goods, services, and ideas. It follows, therefore, that the market will exhibit every shortcoming men exhibit in their thinking and peaceful acting, for, in the broadest sense, it is nothing else but that. It's nothing else but people thinking and acting, right? Peacefully acting. Walter Block, of course, I cannot talk about dwarf-tossing without mentioning Walter, but Walter said that the market is the best means for providing the satisfaction consumer wants, and he would add, and pity the poor souls that are not fortunate enough to live where there are free markets. However, what some consumers want and are willing to pay for in a market are goods whose moral status is, at best, questionable, and in many cases, probably immoral, considered immoral by most of us. But Walter says, this is in defending the undefendable, he says, the free enterprise system, thus, cannot be considered a moral one. Rather, as a means of consumer satisfaction, it can only be as moral as are the goals of the market participants themselves. Since these vary widely, all the way from completely depraved and immoral to the entirely legitimate, the market must be seen as amoral, neither moral nor immoral. So markets, the preferences of economic actors are revealed, and we don't see markets imposing these preferences, but the preferences of the economic actors in those markets are revealed. So now that we've gone through this, we've dispensed with this stupid objection, let's get to some of the more substantive objections in the recent literature, and we'll start with Roth. But here are some slightly better objections. First, markets for repugnant goods won't be sufficiently thick. And we'll talk about what that means. Buyers and sellers in these markets won't feel safe revealing their preferences about these goods. And I am proud of myself. I just had self-control enough to say, they won't feel safe. Anyway, I feel like saying that. So anyway, they won't feel safe revealing their preferences about these goods. And trading in these morally offensive goods presents a negative externality. Okay, so let's go first with the thickness, the market thickness argument. So the idea is that markets, this is according to Roth, markets for repugnant goods won't have sufficient thickness, meaning that markets will fail because there won't be a large enough number of buyers or a large enough number of sellers to, quote, produce satisfactory outcomes on both sides of the transaction. Okay, so what does this sound like? This is basically a fear that either the buyer or the seller will have some market power, right? Either a monopsony where there's a single seller, or a monopoly where there's a single, monopsony is a single buyer, or a monopoly where there's a single seller. But we have to just remember all voluntary transactions are ex ante mutually beneficial, and we don't need an arbitrarily set minimum number of buyers or sellers, and we don't need to declare anything about the outcome of the transactions besides both parties were willing to enter into it voluntarily. So we have plenty of examples of this. You can imagine, what if there's only one living master artist in a particular style that's mastered this particular style, that's willing to paint a large mural on a wall? If there's only one person who paints that particular style, and there's only one quirky homeowner with an appreciation for that kind of style and a desire for a mural in that style on their tall wall, in their entryway, okay? Instead of a hindrance or a market failure, to me, this sounds like a match made in heaven, right? There's only one seller, only one buyer. This sounds like this works out great. But what if there's only one seller with many buyers, or what if there's only one buyer, many sellers? None of this is a problem. This market can still work. There's still opportunities for mutually advantageous trades to be made, and the parties can work that out according to their subjective value preference rankings. Roth also said the economic actors in repugnant markets won't feel safe to reveal their information about the preferences they have about the good. But the cost of revealing your preference for a good, if you feel nervous or intimidated to say, I actually like this and I want this, the cost of revealing your preference for the good is already taken into account in your preference rankings, right? You can have a preference ranking of every possible combination of outcomes, and remember, and you already have that taken into account. This is going to be embarrassing or mortifying to me. Or remember Mighty Mike Murga from the video, for the dwarf being tossed. He says he compared the risk of insult and injury to the compensation, and he says, I'll take the compensation. Back in the 1980s and 90s, before we had video streaming, where y'all now can just go on Amazon Prime or one of those services, Netflix, and you can just watch almost any movie you want right now, right? Wait till after the lecture. But if we wanted to watch a movie back in the 80s or 90s, we did not have the internet or streaming, and we had to go to rent a tape recording of the movie that we wanted to watch. So what if I went to Blockbuster and I wanted to get I wanted to get to watch a My Little Pony movie. And I'm a little bit nervous about it already. I'm thinking, is this, I don't know if this is cool, watching My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic. And so I'm already worried about that. But then I get there and I've got the movie. I'm like, yes, I'm ready to go rent this. I'm going to bravely walk up to the counter to rent it. But then I see, oh no, hot guy from school is working today. Oh no. So I have to decide, right? This decision is before me. I have to decide, what do I value more? The enjoyment I get from My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, or the good opinion of hot guy from school, right? At the Blockbuster. So, the fear of information or revealing the information or preference is already going to be calculated in. When I go and I still say, I don't care what hot guy thinks, I'm renting the video, or walk out without the video, that shows what I ended up preferring. So also the market has a way of working this out, right? So if a lot of people fear judgment from renting My Little Pony movies, the demand is going to be lower then, the price will adjust accordingly, and we'll get to have the enjoyment of watching My Little Pony at a discount then. So others will argue that allowing trades of certain goods is morally offensive to some people, and so because it's negative externality, these trades should not be allowed. It's pretty obvious looking around in this world that we don't all agree on what's moral and good, right? There's some disagreement on what's appropriate, right? So take, for example, pineapple on pizza, right? Some of you nut jobs really love it. The rest of us normal people hate it with the righteous fury it deserves, right? But even though we correctly believe that this pineapple on pizza is a culinary outrage, we shouldn't be able to force our superior tastes on everyone else, right? So let's say 95% of the population. What if 95% of the population hates pineapple on pizza so much that just the thought of someone else consuming it makes them sick, right? We'd say this is a negative externality. However, negative externalities are not calls for state action, because if the action is truly harmful and violated property rights, then it could be addressed through a private legal system, right? This could be addressed, but clearly the thought of someone eating pineapple on pizza does not violate anybody's property rights. It might offend us, but we can simply abstain from consuming pineapple on pizza ourselves. Talk about the markets producing gross stuff. Okay, so the problem with banning the sale of goods that are deemed inappropriate in some way or morally repugnant in some way is the near inevitability of subjective dislike by at least one person, right? So I want to show y'all this little guy. It's an Italian-American immigrant is held still and forced to watch in horror as pineapple is added to pizza for the first time. It's 1914, Brooklyn, New York. I'm sure that happened. Okay, so it was on the internet. It has to be real. Okay, so, but broadening the definition of harm beyond objective property rights violations leads to a situation where virtually all action could be prohibited by someone. So it'd make any meaningful freedom or productive activity impossible. So to be clear, I'm not saying that I'm going to patronize dwarf-tossing. I'm not going to start eating horse meat for lunch. So my defense of these things, I'm going to say, is very limited to saying these activities do not involve aggression. It does not mean these activities are moral or praiseworthy in any way. But in my remaining time, I want to discuss one particular repugnant market that this is actually the one that Roth got a lot of attention for with his work in market design, and it's allowing a legal market for transplantable organs. I'll talk about kidneys mostly because that's where most of the research has been done, and that's the organ that's been transplanted successfully the most. But besides kidneys, there are a lot of other organs that have been successfully transplanted. Here are some other examples: heart transplants, liver, lung, intestines, pancreas. Not the whole eye yet, but corneas have been transplanted successfully. In 2005, this was for successful face transplant. The one that gives me nightmares, though, is the hand transplant. I couldn't find it when I was prepping for this talk, but I remember reading that the first hand transplant, somebody lost their hand, and can you guess what? We just had July 4th earlier this month. Somebody lost their hand in a what kind of accident? Fireworks accident. And they still give this person another hand. But anyway, the hand was donated for the surgery from an inmate in a prison. So that is what I would worry. I would want to know, okay, what was he in for? Did he strangle somebody? I would worry about that. So anyway, because I'd think I might be getting on his hand. I might be getting on his hand's nerves. And I might wake up to that. So anyway, a little bit of background on this. The first kidney transplant was performed in 1954 from a living donor to an identical twin brother. And initially, organ transplants were limited to living donors. The supply was completely altruistic. At the time, this altruistic supply seemed appropriate, relying on just personal affection in the family or family members or friends. That was what motivated people to go through the painful surgery of having a kidney removed to give to someone, to give to your family member or friend. Then in 1983, immunosuppressant drugs were approved for transplant surgeries. The FDA finally, where's Timothy, said that in 1983, they finally approved this drug, cyclosporine, I think is the name of it, for transplant surgeries. What it did was it was preventing the recipient's body from rejecting the transplanted organs. So what this did was it made more transplants possible, not just from living, but also from deceased donors. So because of these new medicines, it was now possible to have transplanted organs from deceased donors who were also possibly anonymous to the recipient. So the familial affection is now no longer required. Naturally, when this happened, the demand for transplants grew. But sadly, the very next year in 1984, we had the National Organ Transplant Act that made it a felony to buy or sell cadaveric organs for transplants. So it was essentially carrying over this altruistic supply into this this altruistic supply procurement policy into this new period that we have where we could have anonymous donors. We are still relying on what it was when when the transplants were mostly from living and related donors, even though it was unnecessary given this new medicine and technology. So the altruistic supply was locked into place. Instead of rationally allocating scarce cadaveric kidneys through the price system, it's done now on a waiting list. So the average wait time for a kidney is about 5 years, but many are taken off the list because while they are waiting and waiting and waiting during those 5 years, their health continues to deteriorate during the waiting, and many die on the waiting list. And the numbers, it's around 8,000 people who die a year that are waiting for an organ transplant, and that understates the numbers because some are never allowed on the list. My father could have benefited greatly from a lung transplant, and they said, well, you have so many health issues that are related to not having enough oxygen, so we're not going to put you on the list. You would not be in good shape or survive the surgery by the time your name came up to the top of the list. So banning the sale of organs was effectively setting the price ceiling at zero, right? And the expected result of a binding price ceiling is always, of course, a shortage. I want to talk about these people that are waiting, the people waiting for a kidney, the number of hours they have to spend hooked up to a dialysis machine. Dialysis is performing the renal function of the kidneys, filtering out the impurities, the toxins, the waste that's in your blood. The number of hours that people have to spend hooked up to the dialysis machine varies depending on their rate of renal failure. Some go for a couple of hours, 2 or 3 days a week, and some have to be on the dialysis machine a lot longer, the bulk of like what we consider the work week. Some people have to be on the dialysis machine that much. Now, no price controls or interventions in the market are good, but this one seems particularly pernicious. When price ceilings are instituted and we have the shortage, usually a black market, we'll see that emerge. In this case, there's not been much of a black market because not many people are willing to go to a black market surgeon and say, hey, cut me open and take my kidney and give it to my friend, right? We're not seeing that. We're not seeing that happening as much. So the shortage, it only continues to get worse. From 1990 to 2021, during that period of time, the percentage of people on the waiting list who received a kidney transplant declined from 55% down to 27% in 2021, the number of people who get a kidney, the number of people on the waiting list who get a kidney in a particular year. Instead of the most obvious solution to the shortage, allowing markets to perform this function of allocating transplantable organs, here's what's been suggested instead. The first one is more education campaigns to encourage young people to sign organ donor cards. This is a bad idea because it's not a clear, precise definition what constitutes being brain dead is. And there was a rumor that I found out was not true, but I'm still suspicious, maybe it is, that they've lowered the standards to declare you brain dead. So when we take cadaveric kidneys or organs, usually it's somebody who has a young person who's died in an accident. And so you come in and you're like in Princess Bride, you're not dead, you're just mostly dead, then they could go ahead and take them. So anyway, I don't recommend signing the donor cards. Another suggestion has been taxpayer-funded reimbursement of explicit costs for living donors. They have expenses like time off work, maybe they have to travel to the surgery center where the transplant's going to be performed. I think this is interesting because their idea is, and they actually said this in the journal article I read, that raising the price for the donors from negative, all costs, compensating that to raising it to zero, that would increase the number of organs donated. So they do believe in the law of supply, that when the price rises, more comes for sale, just not in this particular legal market. And then the next one is Roth's market design. So he designed what he calls a kidney exchange, which is basically a long, complex chain of incompatible pairs of donor and recipient of organs, and where we eventually get everybody a kidney. So let's say we have two pairs of people. We have A and B, and we have C and D. And A is willing to donate a kidney to his friend B, and C is willing to donate a kidney to, family member D. But what if they're not a match? Certain characteristics have to match up, blood type and other physical characteristics. What if they don't match? Well, Roth said we just create a chain where what if A donates to D, A goes into surgery, has his or her kidney removed, and gives it to D. I don't know D, but I'm going and having this removed because this gets my friend B into the chain, and hopefully somebody else is going to come along, like maybe C would then donate to B. But what if C is not a match for B then? So it seems like we're back to, double coincidence of wants requirement, because that's basically what it is. So Roth says, eventually we get enough of these pairs into the chain, and so B ends up getting a kidney from maybe ZZ or whatever. So this seems extra complicated, where we could have the price system handle it. So if we all agree that a market would be the best way to allocate kidneys, just like it's the best way to allocate any other resource, let's look at what do we think this market would look like. What would a legal market for cadaveric kidneys look like? And I'm going to be talking about just cadaveric kidneys, the ones from cadavers, dead bodies, because some people believe that if we have a market for cadaveric kidneys or cadaveric organs, then the need for living donors will go completely away, that it could be fully met by a market for cadaveric organs. So, okay, so what would this market look like? Well, we expect that the demand for cadaveric kidneys is probably very inelastic. For a couple of reasons. There's no real close substitute for having a functioning kidney in your body walking around with you, right? So you can get dialysis, but dialysis is very unappealing for a number of reasons. Being hooked up to a machine and you can't move away from it for several hours out of your week is depressing, and also there's a strong risk of infection. Also, this renal function is a necessity. You have to have it if your body is not able to filter out these toxins, the waste from your system. It can be, renal failure can be fatal. Okay, so when we say demand is inelastic, what we mean is even though there could be a huge change in price, we think that the change in quantity demanded would be very small. So if you think about a very inelastic demand that is something as a necessity for these people who are having renal failure, you think, Sandy, this is a horrible example. Why would you pick this for a case where we should have markets? Well, it's not that the demand is inelastic that's the key to this working, but the key to this working is that the supply is probably very elastic. Now, Rothbard used total revenues approach to elasticity, and he said that elasticity of supply is not a meaningful concept because the movements in the price and the movements in the total revenue are always going to go in the same direction, and they'll always be positive. But what I mean by this is that if we increase the price, if the price rises a little bit from zero to some positive amount, we expect that the response would be a big increase in the number of organs made available for sale. So why do we think this? Well, one is there's excess capacity. A lot of bodies are being buried completely intact with all of their organs in there that could have been used for transplant. So that would be very easy to go ahead and harvest some of those and increase the number of kidneys available for transplant. Secondly, surveys of families of accident victims, where young people died in an accident, surveys indicate, they say, I would have been willing to have his or her organs harvested for transplant. And so the question then remains is, well, why weren't they? Why weren't they? Could it be that it's just a horribly unpleasant task to have to go in and ask when these people are having the worst moment of their entire life, and you go in and say, I'm sorry, your little son didn't make it. I'm so sorry. And then you also have to say, but can we buy his kidneys, right? I mean, this is not the kind of thing that the kind of situation anybody wants to be in. So would it be possible that if there's some financial incentive to do the asking, to do the hard part, to go in there and say, I'm sorry, your son didn't make it, so still some good can come of this if you'll allow us to take these organs, we can compensate you, they'll help defray the cost of the funeral or whatever. But however that works out, entrepreneurs would have an incentive to facilitate mutually beneficial exchanges, right, of kidneys in a creative and respectful, innovative ways. We don't know what the market would look like exactly, but we can imagine there might be third-party procurement firms that are involved in creating spot markets and forward markets. Right? So forward market, some of your grandparents maybe have already done this. They've gone to the funeral home. They've already made all the arrangements for their funeral. Why do they do that? Well, so you don't have to do it at the time when they're, at the time of their death, when you're grieving and maybe not thinking you're most clearly, right? So they go ahead and do that in advance. We could have the same thing with organ procurement policies. There could be forward markets. There could also be spot markets. People who haven't contracted with a procurement firm in advance, but on the spot, we say these would be people, I imagine, that are trained in grief counseling, and they go in, they approach the person, the family members in a respectful way. We don't think that it would be, the used car salesman approach. Hey, what do we have to do to get the kidneys out of you today? Right? I mean, that's not gonna work. People will be like, get out of here, man. Right? So, so it's reasonable to expect that a person would be willing to enter into a contract to accept compensation for the removal of his kidneys at the time of his death when he has no longer any use for them. Right? So the forward markets really make sense. And it may end up with the very elastic supply, that the price of the kidney that attains in the market, it may be well within the reach of what you could get on a GoFundMe, or your church could have a rummage sale for your kidney transplant. So where is this being done? So far, only in Iran. So now the truth is finally out. We know why Trump finally gave in and bombed Iran. He wanted their kidneys. Iran's kidney market is very regulated, but it is still working better than what we have here, right? So it's far from perfect, but they have no waiting lists for kidneys. So I thought this was interesting. The Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, not the type of journal we expect to see pro-market bias, but this guy says a kidney market with payment eliminates shortages, and the Iranian model proves it. So it appears a small monetary incentive would lead to a substantial increase in the procurement rates of cadaveric kidneys and other organs. So we're convinced that a market for organs could work. Economically, it sounds like a good idea. Mark Thornton has made a similar case for legal markets for drugs, including marijuana, but also other drugs like heroin or any of them, because as Timothy Terrell was saying in the last lecture, that goods produced in a market setting, there's going to be a more of a reputation effect that firms producing these drugs want to provide a safe product for their customers. You don't get that from the drug dealer who meets you behind the mall, right? So the narcotics and all of these different examples. I just went through the one with kidneys and other organs for transplant, but it is certainly we can see that markets can do a better job of allocating these goods with the price system functioning than having these bans, altruistic supply, or having the drug cartels from Latin America supply the drugs. So anyway, what are the conclusions then? What are the conclusions? Well, in Austrian welfare economics, we know that voluntary transactions, that is absent coercion, are ex ante mutually beneficial, right? We go into an action or exchange expecting to be better off. Otherwise, we would not make the exchange. If the legal framework considers transplantable organs as a donor's private property, then we can analyze these exchanges for organs just like we analyze any other exchanges. If some or most market participants find this transaction morally reprehensible or repugnant, then the supply or demand for this good, for the kidneys or whatever it is, will be very thin, right? But so what? We don't need an arbitrarily determined minimum number of buyers or sellers. There's some interesting empirical features of this kidney exchange where we have the very elastic supply, very responsive supply that makes it a viable alternative to the current system. And each one of these markets are going to have their own interesting features, but still we can just imagine that how markets could work in these different cases. So more generally, I would say repugnance is not an actionable externality, right? It's just another form of subjective preference. I really like chocolate ice cream. I really don't like horse meat, right? So that's just a subjective preference. And that subjective preference is factored into actors' value scales. So it's not a form of market failure. It's not even an actionable externality because there's no property rights issue. So we don't need any special complex market designs for these transactions. Okay, thank you.